Alex Foster walked briskly through the crowded streets of Manhattan, his mind cluttered with the echoes of a long day at the office. The sharp autumn air bit at his face, a reminder of how far he had come in his career. Wall Street wasn't forgiving, but Alex thrived on the chaos. He adjusted the strap of his briefcase over his shoulder and quickened his pace, eager to leave the demands of the day behind. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was small, barely louder than the hustle of the city around him, but it stopped Alex in his tracks. He looked down to see a young girl, no more than 8 years old, staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. Her dark curls framed a round face that seemed oddly familiar. "Yes?" Alex asked, slightly unnerved by the directness in her gaze. The girl hesitated for a moment, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. "Are you Alex Foster?" she asked, her voice delicate but determined. Alex felt a jolt, as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. He glanced around, searching for the prank or hidden cameras, but found only indifferent pedestrians rushing past. His eyes returned to the girl, his mind racing. "Yes, I am. How do you know my name?" The girl smiled, a shy but knowing look in her eyes. "My name's Grace. My grandma has a picture of you in her wallet. I recognized you right away." Alex blinked, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Your grandma?" he repeated slowly, trying to piece together the bizarre moment. "Who's your grandmother?" Grace took a small step forward, as if what she was about to say needed to be delivered softly. "Her name is Hannah. Hannah Foster." The world seemed to tilt beneath Alex's feet. He hadn't heard that name in years, hadn't allowed himself to think about it. Memories flashed before his eyes. The fights, the love, the choices that tore them apart. He could barely breathe as Grace continued. "She said you were special to her once," Grace added. "I asked her about the man in the picture, and she said your name." Alex's mind spun. His heart raced, grappling with the weight of the revelation. "Hannah Foster?" he murmured again. But the name tasted different now, older, weathered by time. Before he could form another thought, Grace interrupted. "She used to talk about you, and I've always wondered, are you really my grandpa?" Her innocent question hung in the air, as the noise of the city seemed to fade into the background. Alex's throat tightened, his voice barely a whisper. He stopped, unable to process what was happening. His eyes searched the girl's face, and the resemblance he had been trying to deny became undeniable. Grace looked up at him expectantly, her eyes reflecting a hope that Alex wasn't sure he could fulfill. He swallowed hard, his emotions swirling between shock, guilt, and a long-buried sadness. The past, it seemed, had come back to confront him in the most unexpected way. As Alex stood there, frozen in place, he realized something with a sudden clarity. This moment, this little girl, was going to change everything. Alex walked away from Grace that day in a haze, but the weight of her words clung to him. Her innocent question kept replaying in his mind. "Are you really my grandpa?" It was a question that had no simple answer, or at least, none that Alex was prepared to give. The past was something he had buried deep, convinced he'd never need to dig it up again. But now, as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment that evening, the memories came rushing back. Hannah, the woman he had loved more than anyone else, the one he had left behind. He rested his head against the back of the couch, eyes closed, trying to control the flood of emotions. But it was impossible. He could still see her face that last night, flushed with anger and hurt. They had fought bitterly, their words sharper than they intended, cutting deeper than either of them could have imagined. Alex had been on the verge of a major promotion, his dream job at a top Wall Street firm. The opportunity was life-changing, the kind that could elevate his career to heights he had always dreamed of. But Hannah hadn't seen it that way. She had wanted him to stay, to choose their life together over his career. She had wanted him to be there for her in ways that his job couldn't allow. He remembered the moment it all came crashing down. "I can't keep living like this, Alex," Hannah had said, her voice breaking. "You're never here. I feel like I don't even know you anymore." Alex had responded with the cool detachment he had mastered in business, but it had no place in their relationship. "You knew what you signed up for when we got together. This is who I am." I can't just throw away everything I've worked for." Hannah had looked at him with tears in her eyes, her expression a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. "You're not throwing it away. You're throwing us away." That was the moment he should have stopped. He should have walked over to her, held her, told her that he was sorry, that he could make it work. But he didn't. Instead, the silence stretched between them, and then, as if something broke inside her, Hannah had whispered the words that ended everything. "Maybe you should just go." And he had. Without looking back, without a second thought, Alex had packed his bags and left. He told himself it was the right thing to do, that he couldn't afford to be distracted if he wanted to succeed. The pain would fade, he thought. Life would move on. But now, sitting in his apartment, Alex realized that life had moved on without him. Hannah had moved on. She had a daughter now, Emily, Grace had called her. A daughter, born not long after their split. That meant Hannah had been pregnant when they broke up. He had walked away from more than just a relationship. He had walked away from a family. His stomach twisted at the thought. How could he not have known? How could Hannah not have told him? Alex had been so focused on himself, on his success, that he had missed the most important thing in his life. His chance to be a father. And now, a grandfather. The realization struck him hard. He felt a deep sense of regret settle into his bones, something heavier than the ambition that had driven him for so long. The career he had sacrificed everything for suddenly felt hollow. What good were all the promotions, the bonuses, the late-night meetings, when the most important moments of his life had passed him by? As the night dragged on, Alex wandered aimlessly around his apartment, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound in the quiet room. His mind was a storm of thoughts, none of them offering him any peace. He thought of Grace's eyes, so full of innocence and curiosity, and wondered what kind of grandfather he could be to her now. Could he ever make up for the years he had lost? His mind kept circling back to Hannah. How had she managed? How had she raised a child on her own? Did she resent him? Did she think about him as much as he thought about her tonight? The questions haunted him, but there were no answers to be found in the empty rooms of his apartment. He had to know more. He needed to understand what had happened to her after he left. He had to face the reality of his choices, even if it was too late to fix things. At some point, he found himself standing by the window, staring out into the city. New York had a way of making people feel insignificant, and tonight it swallowed him whole. He could see the glow of streetlights below, the distant hum of traffic, and yet, all he could think about was the life he might have had. The life that slipped through his fingers because of the decisions he made. He had spent so many years convincing himself that leaving was for the best, that he had no other choice. But now, for the first time, Alex felt the full weight of his regret. It was like a tidal wave, pulling him under, and he had no idea how to fight it. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow, he would find out more. About Hannah, about Emily, about Grace. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The life he had walked away from had found him again, and he had to face it, whether he was ready or not. The next morning, Alex sat at his kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He hadn't slept. The questions that had plagued him the night before still churned in his mind, refusing to let him rest. Hannah, Emily, Grace. How had they managed without him? Why hadn't Hannah ever reached out to tell him about their daughter? It was almost too much to process, but Alex knew one thing. He couldn't move forward without answers. He needed to know what had happened to the life he had abandoned. By noon, he found himself sitting in front of his computer, staring at a blank search bar. It was absurd, he thought. He was a successful man, calm under pressure, able to make high-stakes decisions at the blink of an eye. But now, he couldn't even type a name into a search engine. His hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Finally, with a sigh, he typed Hannah Foster into the search bar and hit enter. Dozens of results flooded the screen. Some articles, social media profiles, old addresses. He clicked through them, heart pounding in his chest as he sifted through the information. Hannah had left the city not long after they split. That didn't surprise him. New York wasn't kind to people nursing broken hearts. But one detail stopped him cold. There it was, her name, alongside an obituary for her husband, Daniel. Hannah had remarried. Alex felt his breath catch in his throat. She had moved on in ways he hadn't even considered. And now, according to the obituary, she was a widow. His mind raced as he tried to piece it all together. The timeline was murky, but it seemed like Hannah had remarried shortly after Emily was born. There was no mention of Alex, of course. He had vanished from her life before Emily had even arrived. But still, the thought of Hannah building a family without him, a life that included a man who had taken his place, left him feeling strangely hollow. He clicked on another link, this one leading to a social media profile. It was public, showing an array of photos spanning the last few years of Hannah's life. There she was, smiling, her arm around a man who looked kind, unassuming. And there, beside them, was a girl, a teenager now, laughing in one of the photos. Emily, his daughter. Alex stared at the screen, transfixed. Emily was the spitting image of her mother. The same bright smile, the same eyes that had once looked at him with so much love. Seeing her face now, so full of life, brought a surge of emotion that he hadn't anticipated. This was his daughter, the girl he had never met, growing up without him, forming a life he knew nothing about. Scrolling further, Alex saw another set of photos. These were newer, of Hannah, alone with Emily and Grace. The timeline matched up. Grace had to be Hannah's granddaughter. His granddaughter. It was overwhelming, seeing the life he had missed laid out in front of him so plainly. A life full of milestones and memories that had happened without him even knowing. But as much as the photos tugged at his heart, they also filled him with a sense of determination. He couldn't change the past, but maybe there was still a chance to understand it. He needed to find Hannah, talk to her. He needed to meet Emily. With newfound purpose, Alex searched for more information, eventually landing on an address. They were living in a small town upstate. He wrote down the address, his hand shaking slightly. He couldn't just show up out of the blue, but the idea of reaching out to Hannah seemed impossible to ignore now. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about the last time he had spoken to her. It had been over a decade ago. Could she ever forgive him for the way he left? More importantly, did he deserve to be forgiven? The question gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He had to do this, no matter how hard it would be. Alex grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He stopped at the name of an old friend, Kevin, who still had connections in the town where Hannah lived. They hadn't spoken in a while, but if anyone knew what was going on with her, it would be him. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. "Alex? It's been a long time, man," Kevin answered, sounding surprised. "Yeah, it has," Alex replied, his voice steady despite the nervousness gnawing at his gut. "Listen, Kevin, I need a favor. It's about Hannah Foster." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Hannah?" Kevin's voice was cautious. "Why are you asking about her now?" Alex took a deep breath, knowing there was no easy way to explain. "I just found out something. She had a daughter, my daughter, after we split. I didn't know. I never knew." Kevin let out a low whistle. "Wow, man. That's big." "Yeah," Alex agreed, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him again. "I need to find her, Kevin. I need to talk to her and figure all of this out." Kevin was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't know much, but I do know that after Daniel died, Hannah kind of pulled away from everyone. She's been raising her granddaughter, Grace. It's been hard on her. People don't see her around much anymore." Alex swallowed the lump forming in his throat. Do you think she'd talk to me if I reached out?" Another pause. "I don't know, Alex. You really hurt her when you left, but I guess it couldn't hurt to try." After hanging up the phone, Alex sat in silence for a long while. The enormity of what lay ahead was daunting. He had spent years running from his past, building a life that he thought would make him happy. But now, it seemed like the only thing that could bring him peace was the very thing he had left behind. The next step was clear. He had to go to her. He had to find Hannah and face the life he had abandoned. Alex stood outside the modest house, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the front door. The small town seemed miles away from the fast-paced, high-powered world he had left behind in Manhattan. Here, everything was quiet, almost peaceful, but the tension in his stomach told a different story. He had been standing on the sidewalk for nearly 10 minutes, trying to muster the courage to walk up to the door and knock. His hand twitched at his side, as if it might act on its own, but still, he hesitated. What if she doesn't want to see me? The thought had been gnawing at him the whole drive up. It had taken hours, with every mile adding another layer of doubt. What if she's moved on completely? Alex knew Hannah had remarried, knew she had built a life without him. But none of that stopped the questions from swirling in his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to move. He walked up the short path leading to the door, his footsteps loud in the quiet of the afternoon. When he reached the porch, he paused again, staring at the doorbell. It was such a simple thing, but pressing it felt like stepping off a cliff. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hand and rang the bell. The sound echoed inside the house. For a moment, nothing happened. Alex felt the panic rising in his chest again, every fiber of his being telling him to turn around and leave. But then, he heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and there she was, Hannah. The years had changed her, but not as much as Alex had expected. Her hair was a little shorter, streaked with strands of silver that hadn't been there before, and there were fine lines around her eyes. But she was still Hannah, still the woman he had loved, the woman he had hurt. For a second, she just stared at him, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Her eyes widened slightly, her hand still gripping the door as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Alex," she said, her voice soft, filled with equal parts shock and disbelief. Alex swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Hannah," he managed, his voice rough. "It's been a long time." Hannah blinked, recovering from the initial shock. She stepped back, folding her arms across her chest, her expression quickly hardening. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone now cautious, guarded. Alex shifted uncomfortably, the weight of everything he wanted to say pressing down on him. I had to come. I found out about Emily, about Grace." At the mention of their daughter, Hannah's face tightened. Now, after all this time, her voice was low, simmering with the anger she had clearly kept buried for years. Alex winced. "I didn't know, Hannah. I swear I didn't know." Hannah let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You didn't know because you didn't care to. You left, Alex. You made your choice. Wall Street, your career. That was all that mattered to you." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but Alex didn't flinch. She was right. After all, he had left, and he had chosen his career over her, over the life they could have had together. But he hadn't expected the consequences to be so far-reaching, hadn't known that he had abandoned more than just a relationship. "I know," Alex said quietly. "I know I hurt you, and if I could take it back, I would. But I'm here now, Hannah. I want to understand. I need to understand." Hannah stared at him for a long moment, her arms still crossed protectively over her chest. Then, with a sigh, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Fine," she said, her voice still cold. "But don't expect anything from me, Alex. I'm not the same person I was back then." Alex nodded, stepping into the house. The interior was warm and homey, filled with photographs on the walls and shelves, paintings that reflected a life lived. His eyes were immediately drawn to the pictures, family photos. There were pictures of Emily as a baby, as a little girl, and more recently, a young woman. And in nearly all of them, there was Grace, the same girl who had approached him on the street, her smile bright and full of life. Hannah noticed his gaze and spoke quietly, as if the memories in those photos were too fragile to disturb. "Emily never knew about you. I didn't tell her. When you left, I didn't know how to explain it to her. She grew up believing that Daniel was her father." Alex felt his stomach twist. "And she still doesn't know?" Hannah shook her head. "No, not yet. She has no idea you even exist." The weight of her words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. Alex ran a hand through his hair, trying to process it all. "I didn't come here to make things harder for you, or for Emily. I just want a chance to know her. And Grace." Hannah's expression softened slightly, but her guard didn't drop completely. It's not that simple, Alex. You can't just walk back into our lives after all these years and expect everything to be okay. Emily's been through a lot. Losing Daniel, it changed her. Alex nodded, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. He had missed so much, more than he could ever make up for. I'm not expecting things to be easy. I just want to try. Hannah studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, with a sigh, she moved toward the kitchen, motioning for him to follow. You should sit down, she said, her tone still wary but less hostile. If we're going to have this conversation, it's going to be a long one. Alex followed her into the kitchen, his heart still racing. But the fact that he was even here, inside her home, having this conversation, felt like a step forward, no matter how small. He took a seat at the table, and Hannah sat across from him, her fingers nervously tapping against the edge of the table. So, where do we start? She asked, her voice softer now, tinged with exhaustion. Alex looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the years they had lost. I guess we start with the truth, he said quietly. All of it. And so, they began to talk about the past, about Emily, about the years they had spent apart. The conversation was painful, full of unspoken wounds and regrets, but it was a conversation they both needed. There was still so much left unresolved, so much that couldn't be fixed overnight. But for the first time in years, Alex felt like he was beginning to understand the life he had walked away from. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges he wasn't sure he was ready for. But sitting there, across from Hannah, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn back now. Alex sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him, Hannah leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant as if she were somewhere far away. The conversation between them had stretched for hours, moving through painful memories, lost opportunities, and things left unsaid. There was a tension in the air, heavy but not hostile, like the calm before a storm. You really didn't know, did you? Hannah's voice was quiet, almost as if she was speaking to herself rather than to Alex. He shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the table. No, I didn't. I swear, Hannah, if I'd known about Emily, I would have come back. The words sounded hollow even to him. Could he have really made that promise back then, when ambition had been his driving force? Hannah looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth. I wanted to tell you, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. But after you left, I didn't know how. You made it clear that your career was more important than us, than me. And then when I found out I was pregnant, I was already alone. Alex flinched, the guilt seeping deeper into his bones. I know I hurt you, he said softly, and I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I was giving up. Hannah's lips tightened into a thin line. It wasn't just me you gave up, Alex. It was Emily too. She grew up without a father, without even knowing who you were. Alex swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent so long running from the past, convincing himself that what he had done was justified. But now, faced with the reality of the lives he had impacted, he felt a deep sense of regret. It wasn't just about Hannah anymore. It was about Emily and Grace, and the family he had abandoned without even knowing it existed. I want to meet her, Alex said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Emily, I want to meet my daughter. Hannah let out a long, tired sigh. It's not that simple, she said, her voice strained. You can't just show up and expect her to accept you. She doesn't even know you exist, Alex. How do you think she's going to react when she finds out the truth? That her real father abandoned her before she was even born? The harshness of her words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on making things right that he hadn't considered how Emily would feel. To her, he was a stranger, a man who had chosen his career over her mother, over her. How could he expect her to forgive him? I don't expect her to accept me right away, Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I need to try. I owe her that much. Hannah stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. I don't want to see her get hurt, Alex. She's been through so much already. When Daniel died, it nearly broke her. He was the only father she ever knew. And now you want to come into her life and tell her that it was all a lie? That the man she thought was her father isn't? The pain in her voice was palpable, and Alex felt it echo in his own chest. He hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered how devastating the truth might be for Emily. But still, he couldn't walk away. Not again. I understand why you're scared, he said carefully, and I'm not asking for everything to be fixed overnight. But I've already missed so much. Please, Hannah, I need to try. Hannah didn't respond immediately. She looked away, her fingers tapping nervously against the edge of the table. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until finally, she turned back to him. I don't know if I can do that, Alex. I don't know if I can just let you walk into her life after all these years. Alex's heart sank, but he forced himself to nod. I get it. I do. But she deserves to know the truth. And so do I. Hannah was quiet for a moment, her eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. I'll talk to her, she said at last, her voice resigned. But I'm not promising anything. If she doesn't want to meet you, that's her decision. You have to respect that. Alex felt a rush of gratitude, even though he knew this was only the beginning of a long, painful process. Thank you, he said quietly. That's all I'm asking. Hannah nodded, but there was no warmth in her expression. You should go, she said, standing up and moving toward the door. I need time to think about all of this. And so does Emily. Alex stood as well, his heart heavy with the weight of the conversation. He knew there was no easy solution, no quick fix to the years of damage he had caused. But the fact that Hannah was even willing to speak to Emily on his behalf was more than he could have hoped for. As he stepped out onto the porch, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. He turned back to Hannah, wanting to say something, anything, that might ease the tension between them. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, they just stood there for a moment, the distance between them now more than just physical. I'll be in touch, Hannah said finally, her voice flat. I'll let you know what Emily decides. Alex nodded, his throat tight. Okay. And with that, the door closed softly behind her, leaving Alex standing on the porch, alone with his thoughts. The drive back to the city was long and silent. Alex's mind raced, replaying every word of their conversation, every pained expression on Hannah's face. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake. If coming back into their lives after all this time was just a selfish attempt to ease his own guilt. But no matter how much doubt crept in, there was one truth that kept him going. He needed to meet his daughter. He needed to see her, to understand the life she had lived without him. For the first time in years, Alex felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had spent so long focused on his career, on his own success, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Now, all he could do was hope that it wasn't too late to make things right. Alex's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as he pulled into the parking lot of the small cafe. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, checking his appearance for what felt like the 100th time. It wasn't a business meeting. It wasn't even a reunion. This was something entirely different, something more personal and terrifying than any boardroom negotiation he had ever faced. Hannah had called him the day before, her voice tense but composed. She had spoken with Emily. It hadn't gone well. Emily hadn't taken the news easily, and Alex couldn't blame her. To suddenly find out that the man who had raised her wasn't her biological father, that her real father was a stranger who had walked out of her mother's life before she was even born, that was a lot to process. Hannah had explained that Emily was angry, confused, but willing to meet him. A small step, but one that filled Alex with both hope and dread. He had agreed to meet them here, at this quiet cafe outside of town. His stomach churned as he imagined what the conversation would be like. What could he possibly say to a daughter he had never known? How could he explain why he hadn't been there for her? His thoughts raced, and for a brief moment, he considered driving away, disappearing before they arrived. But he couldn't do that. Not again. With a deep breath, Alex stepped out of the car and walked toward the cafe's entrance. The small bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the warmth of the room hit him, along with the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods. It was a cozy place, quiet enough for the kind of conversation they needed to have. Alex scanned the room, looking for Hannah and Emily. There they were, sitting in a booth by the window. Hannah was facing him, her expression tight, while Emily sat beside her, staring down at the table. Alex froze for a second. The sight of his daughter, bringing a flood of emotions he hadn't anticipated. She was older now, of course, a young woman, but there was no mistaking the resemblance to Hannah. She had the same dark eyes, the same strong features. Her hands were clenched into fists on the table, her whole body radiating tension. Alex's heart pounded as he made his way over, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the table, Hannah glanced up at him, giving a brief nod of acknowledgement, while Emily continued to stare at the table, refusing to meet his eyes. "Hi," Alex said quietly, his voice hoarse. It felt like a weak opening, but he didn't know what else to say. Hannah gestured toward the empty seat across from them. "Sit," she said, her tone neutral but firm. Alex sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like a thick blanket. For a few agonizing seconds, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, and Alex could feel the tension radiating off Emily. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say to make this better? To explain himself? There were no easy answers. It was Emily who broke the silence first. Her voice was cold, each word clipped. "Why are you here?" Alex looked at her, his heart twisting at the anger in her tone. She finally raised her eyes to meet his, and he saw the hurt there, the pain that he had caused without even knowing it. "I'm here because I wanted to meet you," he said quietly. "I know I've missed a lot, and I know I can't make up for it. But I want to know you, Emily." She stared at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she scoffed, shaking her head. "You want to know me?" Her voice was sharp, her words like knives. "Where were you my whole life, huh? You didn't care about me then. You didn't even know I existed." Alex winced at her words, feeling each one cut deeper than the last. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I can't take back the years I missed. I wish I could." Emily's eyes narrowed, her jaw clenched. "That's not good enough," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "You don't just get to show up now, after everything, and say you're sorry." Alex's chest tightened, but he nodded. "I know it's not good enough. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm here because I want to try. I want to make things right, if you'll let me." For a moment, Emily didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find some trace of sincerity. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer but still full of pain. "You weren't there for my mom, either. She did everything by herself. She raised me without you. Daniel was the one who was there for me. He was my dad. You weren't." Hannah shifted slightly in her seat, her face tense as Emily spoke. Alex could see how hard this was for her, too, sitting between them, caught between the life she had built with Daniel and the one they had lost when Alex walked away. "I know," Alex said softly, his throat tight. "I know I wasn't there, and I know Daniel was a good man. I don't want to take that away from you, Emily. I'm not trying to replace him. I just want a chance to know you. That's all." Emily's expression hardened again, her arms crossing over her chest defensively. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why come back now, after all these years?" Alex took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "Because I didn't know you existed until a few days ago," he admitted. "I thought I was doing the right thing when I left. I thought my career was the most important thing in my life. But I was wrong. And when I found out about you, I knew I couldn't keep running from the past. I couldn't keep pretending that none of this mattered. You matter, Emily, more than I ever realized." Emily looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared out the window. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken feelings, and Alex felt the weight of every word, every moment of time he had lost with her. Hannah, who had remained mostly silent, finally spoke. "Emily, you don't have to decide anything today. This is a lot to process, but you should know that Alex is telling the truth. He didn't know about you, and as much as I resented him for leaving, I didn't tell him either. He wasn't given the chance to be your father. That's on me, too. Emily didn't respond right away. She sat there, staring out the window, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Finally, she let out a long sigh and turned back to Alex. Her expression was no longer as sharp, but the hurt was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I don't know if I can just let you into my life after everything." Alex nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I don't expect you to," he said gently. "I just want you to know that I'm here, if and when you're ready." Emily looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was something, a small step in the right direction. And for Alex, that was enough, for now. As he sat there, watching Emily and Hannah leave the cafe, he knew that the road ahead was going to be long and difficult. But he also knew that, for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for something that truly mattered. Over the next few weeks, Alex tried to settle into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and daunting. His days were still filled with work, conference calls, meetings, and the ceaseless demands of Wall Street. But his thoughts often drifted to Emily and Hannah, to the life he was only now starting to piece together. There was no sudden transformation, no overnight breakthrough. Instead, there were slow, tentative steps forward. Emily hadn't rejected him outright, but she hadn't exactly welcomed him into her life, either. For now, she kept him at a distance, cautious, skeptical. Alex understood this was the price he had to pay. He knew he had to earn her trust, not just ask for it. One chilly Saturday morning, Alex found himself standing outside a modest soccer field in Hannah's town. He felt out of place in his designer coat and polished shoes, surrounded by parents bundled in casual clothes, cheering their kids from the sidelines. But he was here because Grace, the granddaughter he barely knew, had a soccer game, and Hannah had reluctantly told him about it during a brief phone call earlier in the week. "She doesn't know who you are," Hannah had warned. "Emily hasn't told her anything yet. So, don't expect her to understand why you're there." Alex had assured her that he wouldn't approach Grace, that he just wanted to watch from a distance. He knew this was a step forward, even if it was small and tenuous. Hannah's hesitation was still palpable, but she hadn't barred him from coming. That alone felt like progress. The field was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, coaches shouting instructions, and parents clapping encouragement. Alex scanned the crowd, trying to spot Grace. His heart skipped when he finally saw her. She was running toward the goal, her ponytail bouncing behind her. She was smaller than the other kids, but there was a fierceness in her determination, a drive that seemed far too familiar to Alex. He watched her for the entire game, his eyes following every move she made. She was good, really good, quick on her feet, agile, and utterly focused on the ball. Alex couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride swell within him, despite knowing he hadn't been part of this child's life. He wondered what it would have been like to teach her how to kick a ball, to cheer for her at games, to be the kind of grandfather she deserved. At one point, Grace scored a goal, and her teammates swarmed around her in celebration. She beamed, her face lit up with pure joy. Alex found himself clapping along with the crowd, a genuine smile breaking across his face. It was a moment of simple happiness, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to be part of moments like this in Grace's life. After the game ended, Alex lingered near the parking lot, keeping a safe distance as the kids gathered their things and parents started to leave. He watched as Emily arrived, walking briskly toward Grace with a proud smile. She hugged her daughter, lifting her off the ground in a moment of pure affection. It was a beautiful sight, but it also highlighted everything Alex had missed. The years of not being there, of not even knowing. As Emily and Grace made their way toward the car, Alex felt a strange mix of longing and resignation. He wanted to call out to them, to make his presence known, but he knew this wasn't the right time. He wasn't ready, and neither were they. So he stood there, watching as they drove away, the sound of the car's engine fading into the crisp autumn air. The ride back to the city was quiet, the events of the morning replaying in his mind. He felt torn. encouraged by Grace's energy and spirit, but deeply aware of the distance that still separated him from her. It was the same with Emily. He had spoken to her only a few times since their meeting at the cafe, mostly through brief texts. She remained cautious, her responses short, but she didn't shut him out entirely. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a message from Emily. It was a photo of Grace, holding up a trophy from a soccer tournament. The caption read, "She won today." It was just 3 words, but for Alex, it felt monumental. He stared at the picture for a long time, taking in Grace's beaming face, the pride in her eyes. He typed a reply carefully, not wanting to say too much. "That's amazing. She's really talented." The reply came quicker than he expected. "She works hard. She loves the game." There was a pause, and then another message appeared. "Maybe you could come to the next one, if you want." Alex's heart leaped at the invitation. It was a small step, but it felt significant. "I'd love that," he replied, trying to keep his tone casual, though his excitement was barely contained. The next Saturday, Alex was back at the same field, this time with a sense of purpose. He watched Grace's game with the same intensity as before, but now there was a new feeling, hope. He spotted Emily standing on the sidelines, her arms crossed as she watched Grace play. For the first time, she glanced over and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't warm, but it was a start. After the game, Emily approached him. Grace was still with her teammates, laughing and chatting animatedly. "She doesn't know yet," Emily said quietly, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I understand," Alex assured her. "I'm just glad to be here." Emily nodded, her face softening slightly. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice low but sincere. "It's going to take time, Alex. For her and for me." "I know," Alex replied. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait as long as it takes." They stood there in silence for a moment, the sound of children's laughter filling the air around them. It wasn't the perfect reunion he had imagined, but it was real, and it was happening. Suddenly, Grace ran over, holding her trophy high above her head. "Mom, did you see? I won again," she shouted excitedly. Emily smiled warmly. "I saw, sweetheart. You were amazing." Grace beamed, then noticed Alex standing there. She looked at him curiously, her head tilting slightly. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice innocent. Emily hesitated, glancing at Alex before responding. He's someone who wanted to see you play today. He's a friend." Alex felt a pang of disappointment at the word friend, but he understood. It was the first step of many, and he couldn't rush it. Grace looked at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Well, I hope you liked it," she said simply, her attention quickly shifting back to her teammates. Alex watched her go, his heart swelling with a strange mix of joy and sorrow. "I did," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Emily turned to him, her expression softer than it had been before. "I'm trying, Alex," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "I really am." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "And I'm grateful for all of this." As he drove back to his apartment that afternoon, Alex felt a sense of cautious optimism for the first time in years. He still had a long way to go, but he was beginning to see a path forward. And for the first time, it felt like the past wasn't just something to regret. It was something he could learn from, something that could guide him toward a future with the people he had lost. Weeks passed, and the fragile connection between Alex, Emily, and Grace began to strengthen, though slowly and unevenly. Each interaction was tentative, filled with moments of hope shadowed by lingering doubts. Emily's texts became more frequent, sometimes sharing snippets of Grace's day-to-day life. An upcoming test, a dance recital at school, or a funny comment Grace had made at dinner. The exchanges were short, cautious, but Alex clung to each message like it was a lifeline, proof that Emily was at least willing to let him be a part of their lives, even if only in small ways. He made sure not to push too hard, sensing that any sign of impatience or desperation would send Emily retreating again. One crisp Saturday morning, Emily reached out with an unexpected request. "Would you like to come over for dinner? Grace has been asking about you." The text was brief, but it was monumental to Alex. Grace had been asking about him. That simple fact filled him with a mix of joy and nervousness. He responded quickly, trying not to sound too eager. "I'd love to. Let me know what time." Emily suggested 6 o'clock, and Alex spent the rest of the day trying to calm the nerves that roiled inside him. When he finally arrived at Emily's house, he felt the same surge of anxiety that had plagued him since he'd first stepped back into their lives. He stood at the door for a moment, collecting himself before knocking. It felt like the stakes were higher this time, as if this dinner was a test he had to pass, not just for Emily but for Grace as well. Emily opened the door, giving him a small, hesitant smile. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the smells of home-cooked food. Alex was hit by a sense of familiarity, the kind that tugged at long-buried memories of dinners with Hannah, the kind of domesticity he had once taken for granted. Grace came bounding down the hallway, her ponytail bouncing as she ran up to Emily. "Is he here, Mom? Is he really here?" she asked excitedly, peeking around Emily's legs to catch a glimpse of Alex. Emily smiled down at her daughter. "Yes, he's here," she said gently, her voice filled with a mix of pride and caution. Grace's eyes lit up as she looked at Alex. "Hi," she said boldly, her voice bright. "Mom said you wanted to meet me. Is that true?" Alex felt his throat tighten at the straightforwardness of the question. He crouched down to be at her level, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, it's true. I've wanted to meet you for a long time, Grace." Grace studied him for a moment, her eyes curious but not hostile. "Mom says you're a friend," she said matter-of-factly. Alex nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "Yes, I am. And I hope we can be friends too." She considered this for a moment, then smiled. "Okay, but do you like spaghetti? Because that's what we're having for dinner." Alex couldn't help but laugh at the innocence of her question. "I love spaghetti," he said earnestly. "Good," Grace replied, satisfied with his answer. "Because Mom makes the best spaghetti ever." Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. The conversation was mostly light. Emily asked about Alex's job, and Grace interjected with stories about her friends and school. There were moments of awkwardness, of course, small silences that spoke of the still unresolved tension between Alex and Emily. But there were also moments of genuine connection, like when Grace proudly showed Alex her latest soccer trophy, and he listened intently as she explained each play that led to her victory. As they ate, Alex felt a warmth spreading in his chest. It was the simple pleasure of sitting at a dinner table with family, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He caught Emily watching him a few times, her expression guarded but not as distant as it had been in the beginning. After dinner, Emily cleared the plates while Alex and Grace remained at the table, drawing together on a piece of scrap paper. Grace's enthusiasm was infectious, her laughter filling the room. She had warmed to him faster than Alex had anticipated, but he knew that this was only the beginning. Building trust would take time, and it was a process that couldn't be rushed. Later, as Grace was getting ready for bed, Emily and Alex found themselves alone in the living room. The air was thick with the things still left unsaid. Emily broke the silence first. "She really likes you," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on a photo on the mantel. One of Grace with Daniel, smiling broadly. Alex followed her gaze, feeling a pang of guilt. "I'm glad," he replied softly. "But I know this is still hard for you, Emily. I don't want to make things more complicated than they already are." Emily turned to him, her eyes full of a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "It is complicated, Alex. I've spent so many years trying to protect Grace, trying to be everything she needs. And now, you're here, wanting to be part of her life. It's a lot to handle." Alex nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'm not trying to take away from everything you've done for her. You've been an amazing mother, Emily. I see that, and I respect it. I just want to find my place in her life, whatever that looks like." Emily's eyes softened slightly, but the pain was still there, lingering beneath the surface. "I want to believe that, Alex," she said, her voice cracking a bit. "But it's hard. You weren't there when I needed you the most. When Grace needed you the most." Alex's heart ached at her words, the regret more potent than ever. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wish I could change the past, but I can't. All I can do is be here now and try to be the father and the grandfather I never was. Emily looked away, her shoulders tense. I want to give you a chance, I really do. But I'm scared, Alex. I'm scared that you'll hurt her the way you hurt me. And I can't let that happen. He took a deep breath, stepping closer. I understand your fear, Emily, but I'm not going anywhere this time. I'm here, for real. And I'll prove that to you, to both of you, every day if that's what it takes. For a moment, Emily just stood there, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then she nodded slowly, a small but significant gesture of acceptance. Okay, she said quietly, but I'm going to hold you to that. I wouldn't expect anything less, Alex replied. They stood there in silence for a while, the tension between them slowly shifting into something softer, something closer to understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Before he left, Alex leaned down to say goodnight to Grace. She looked up at him sleepily, her voice drowsy but sincere. Are you coming back again? She asked, rubbing her eyes. Alex smiled, his heart full. Yes, I am, he promised. Whenever you want me to. Okay, Grace said simply. Good night. As Alex walked to his car, the night air crisp around him, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges he couldn't fully foresee. But for the first time, it felt like he was truly moving forward, step by step, day by day, toward a future that, despite everything, felt worth fighting for. The weeks that followed felt like a delicate dance between Alex, Emily, and Grace. The steps were uncertain, each move filled with hesitation, but there was also a rhythm beginning to emerge, one of slow but genuine connection. Emily remained cautious, but she allowed Alex more access to their lives, inviting him to dinners, soccer games, and even family movie nights. For Alex, the new normal was both heartening and overwhelming. After so many years of pursuing success in the high-stakes world of finance, the simplicity of this new life was surprisingly fulfilling. He spent less time at the office, no longer compelled by the relentless pressure of Wall Street. He started to recognize that his priorities were shifting, and that, for the first time in years, he was okay with that. One evening, as Alex sat on the floor of Emily's living room playing a board game with Grace, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A family photo album sitting on a shelf. It was thick, its pages worn from years of use. His curiosity piqued. He glanced up at Emily, who was sitting on the couch, watching them with a small smile. Mind if I take a look? Alex asked, nodding toward the album. Emily hesitated, her expression unreadable. Sure, she finally said. Go ahead. Alex reached for the album, carefully opening it to the first page. The initial photos were of Emily as a baby, her eyes wide and curious. As he turned the pages, he saw her grow, from a toddler to a young girl, then a teenager. There were birthday parties, school plays, and vacations, all moments he had missed. Each photo was a stark reminder of the life he could have been part of, but hadn't. He paused when he reached a series of photos of Daniel, Emily's stepfather. In every picture, he was smiling, his arm around Emily or holding her hand. It was clear that he had been deeply involved in her life, a real father figure in every sense of the word. Alex felt a mix of gratitude and regret. Gratitude for the man who had stepped up when he hadn't, and regret for not having been there to fill that role himself. Daniel was a good man, Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. He loved Grace like she was his own granddaughter. Alex nodded, his throat tight. I can see that, he said softly. I'm grateful he was there for you. Emily's gaze softened, but there was still a trace of pain in her eyes. He was everything I wanted in a father, she admitted. And when he died, it felt like I lost that all over again. I'm so sorry, Emily, Alex said, his voice full of sincerity. I know I can never replace what you lost, but I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to be a part of your life and Grace's. Emily nodded slowly, her expression torn. I know you're trying, Alex, and I can see that Grace really likes you. But you have to understand, this isn't just about building a relationship with her. It's also about proving to me that you're not going to disappear again. The weight of her words hung between them, heavy and raw. Alex understood the depth of what she was asking. "I promise you, I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I've made that mistake before, and I won't make it again." As the evening drew to a close, Grace ran up to Alex, clutching the board game pieces in her small hands. "You'll come back tomorrow, right?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. Alex smiled, the warmth in his chest spreading. "If it's okay with your mom, then yes, I will." Emily looked at them, her face softening at the sight of Grace's excitement. "It's okay," she said quietly. "You can come back tomorrow." Over time, Emily's cautious demeanor began to shift, her defenses lowering incrementally. There were still moments of tension, times when old wounds reopened unexpectedly, but the effort to bridge the gap between them was real on both sides. Then, one afternoon, a new challenge presented itself. Alex received a phone call from his boss at the firm. There was an opportunity, one that was both lucrative and demanding. It would require him to travel frequently, potentially spending weeks at a time overseas. It was the kind of offer that once would have thrilled him, one that aligned perfectly with the career-driven life he had built. But now, it felt like a cruel test of everything he was trying to rebuild. He sat at his desk, the phone call still echoing in his ears, as he considered the decision before him. Taking the job meant financial security, prestige, and a return to the career trajectory he had always pursued. But it also meant less time with Emily and Grace, and more missed milestones. That evening, during another family dinner at Emily's house, Alex felt the weight of his choice bearing down on him. He tried to keep the conversation light, but Emily sensed something was off. "You're quiet tonight," she observed. "Is something wrong?" Alex hesitated, unsure how to frame the dilemma. "I got a job offer today," he admitted slowly. "It's a big one, but it would mean a lot of traveling, being away for long periods." Emily's face remained neutral, but her eyes revealed a flicker of worry. "And what do you think?" she asked. Alex sighed deeply. "Honestly, I don't know. It's everything I used to want, everything I've worked for. But now I have something else to consider." Emily looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "You have to decide what you really want, Alex. I can't make that choice for you." "I know," he replied. "But this time, I want to choose with my family in mind." Emily's gaze softened, a hint of hope in her eyes. "If you decide to stay, it has to be because you really want to, not just because you think it's what we want." "I want to be here," Alex said, his voice steady. "More than anything else, I want to be part of this family." The next day, Alex made his decision. He turned down the job offer, choosing instead to focus on the relationships he was rebuilding. It wasn't an easy choice. His ambition had been a constant companion for so long that it felt strange to step back from it. But it also felt liberating, as if he were finally breaking free from a life that had kept him distant from the people who mattered most. When he told Emily about his decision, her reaction was a mix of relief and disbelief. "You really did it?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "Yes," Alex said simply. "I'm all in. No more distractions." Emily nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through. "That's a big step," she said, "but it's also the right one." The days that followed were filled with more small victories. Grace began to call him Grandpa occasionally, and Emily started to let him be part of her and Grace's daily routines. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching Grace chase fireflies in the yard, Emily turned to Alex with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I never thought we'd get to this point," she admitted. "But I'm glad we did." Alex's heart swelled with gratitude. "Me too," he said softly. "I'm just sorry it took me so long to get here." Emily smiled, her eyes filled with a mixture of acceptance and lingering sadness. "We can't change the past, Alex, but we can try to make the future better." And as they sat there, the sound of Grace's laughter filling the evening air, Alex knew that this was exactly where he wanted to be, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Months passed, and the life Alex had begun to build with Emily and Grace slowly became less about proving himself and more about simply being there. He found a new rhythm, one that was quieter, more meaningful than anything he had experienced before. He was present for Grace's soccer games, helped Emily with the groceries, and even took on the daunting task of learning how to braid Grace's hair, much to her amusement. The moments were small, but they were real. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations, just the steady, everyday acts of a man determined to be a part of the family he had once walked away from. One crisp fall afternoon, Alex picked Grace up from school, something that had become part of their routine. As they drove home, Grace was unusually quiet, staring out the window with a pensive look on her face. "Everything okay, kiddo?" Alex asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Grace hesitated, then turned to him with a serious expression. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Alex replied, his heart tightening slightly at the word grandpa. He still wasn't used to it, but he cherished it every time she said it. "Why weren't you here when I was born?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Mom said you didn't know about me, but why didn't you know?" Alex felt a lump form in his throat. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing that it was only a matter of time before Grace asked about his absence. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, turning to face her fully. "That's a really good question," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And it's not an easy one to answer. The truth is, I made a mistake a long time ago. I thought I was doing the right thing by focusing on my career, but I didn't realize what I was leaving behind." Grace's eyes were wide, her expression earnest. "But you didn't know about me or Mom, right?" "Right," Alex confirmed, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't know, but I wish I had. I would have made different choices if I had known about you and your mom." Grace seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "But you're here now," she said, her tone softening. "That's what matters, right?" Alex's heart swelled at her simple, forgiving words. "Yes," he agreed. "That's what matters." When they arrived home, Emily was waiting for them on the porch. She watched as Alex and Grace climbed out of the car, her face lighting up when she saw Grace's smile. "How was school today?" she asked, reaching out to smooth Grace's hair. "It was good," Grace replied brightly. "Grandpa told me why he wasn't here before, but he's here now, so it's okay." Emily's eyes flickered to Alex, a silent question in them. Alex nodded subtly, and she seemed to understand. "That's right," Emily said, her voice warm. "He's here now." That evening, they gathered around the dinner table, a simple meal of spaghetti and salad in front of them. It was a typical dinner, filled with laughter and stories about Grace's day, but there was a deeper sense of contentment in the air. It was the kind of normalcy Alex had never thought he would experience. A quiet, steady joy that came from being part of something bigger than himself. After dinner, as Grace was getting ready for bed, she ran up to Alex with a book in her hand. "Will you read me a story tonight?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. Alex's heart leapt at the request. "Of course," he said, taking the book from her. "Which one do you want?" "This one," Grace said, handing him a well-worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. "It's my favorite." They settled into Grace's bed, Alex's voice steady as he read the familiar story aloud. Grace nestled close, her small hand resting on his arm as she listened intently. It was a simple, tender moment, one that Alex cherished deeply. As he reached the end of the story, he glanced down to see that Grace's eyes were already closing, her breathing slow and even. He closed the book quietly, placing it on the nightstand. "Good night, Grace," he whispered, leaning down to press a gentle kiss on her forehead. "I love you." Grace murmured something in her sleep, a faint smile on her lips. Alex watched her for a moment longer, his heart full. When he stepped out into the hallway, he found Emily standing there, her eyes soft with emotion. "You're good with her," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and relief. Alex looked at her, his eyes reflecting the same emotion. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time," he said honestly. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think you're doing a good job," she admitted. "And so does she." They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still scars, still memories of a past that couldn't be erased. But there was also a sense of healing, of possibility. "Emily," Alex began, his voice low but earnest. I know I can't change the past, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can never fully make up for. But I want you to know that I'm here for you too, not just Grace. I want us to find a way forward together, as a family." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but there was a warmth in her smile. "I know, Alex," she said softly, "and I want that too." It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was enough. A promise of a future that was no longer defined by regret, but by hope. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a comfortable routine. Alex, Emily, and Grace continued to navigate their new reality, each day bringing small victories and the occasional setback. But the bond between them grew stronger, grounded in honesty and a shared commitment to move forward. One sunny afternoon, as they all sat in the backyard, Grace looked up from her drawing and asked, "Are you going to stay forever, Grandpa?" Alex looked at Emily, then back at Grace. "Yes," he said with conviction, "forever and always." And for the first time in a long while, Alex felt a sense of peace. Peace not only with his past, but with the man he had become. The journey had been long and painful, filled with mistakes and regrets. But as he sat there, surrounded by the family he had almost lost, he knew that every step had led him to this moment. It was far from perfect, but it was real. And that, he realized, was everything he had ever wanted.